Positive reinforcement is the most widely applied principle of behavior analysis. Reinforcement is the process in which a behavior is strengthened by the immediate consequence that reliably follows its occurrence. To strengthen a behavior means to make it occur more frequently. When a type of behavior is followed by reinforcement, there will be an increased future frequency of that type of behavior. What that basically means is if you engage in a certain behavior, that behavior gets you something that you want, then you're more likely to engage in that same behavior when you want the same outcome in the future. The term positive in conjunction with reinforcement to denote a specific form of reinforcement doesn't necessarily mean that something good. It means that something is being added or the addition of something. We cannot talk about any form of reinforcement without talking about applied behavior analysis because what we know about reinforcers is derived from the field of ABA. It's cited frequently in the area of intervention for all students. Although ABA is often cited as a practice, such as popular methodology, such as verbal behavior, positive behavior support, and direct instruction, while all of these practices are not synonymous with ABA, but they use its principles in design. A more accurate way to describe ABA is that it's a science devoted to understanding the improvement of human behavior. So let's look at an ABA model of behavior. A behavior is influenced by the environment. The antecedent is the event that happens immediately before the behavior, and the consequence is an event that happens immediately after. So then you have reinforcement. So what we're going to talk about in this module is positive reinforcement. So behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's important that we analyze this three-term contingency, that we only think about observable events. The antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence are things that are observable, things that we can actually see and measure. We don't see things as getting mad. You can't observe that. So you can't choose that to be the antecedent at an observable event that occurred prior to the behavior. So let's think about only observable events when we think about our ABC, or three-term contingency. For example, Johnny falls down, Johnny cries, and then the teacher holds him. The antecedent is he falls down, the behavior is he cries, the consequence is Johnny gets held by his teacher when he cries. If you're familiar with ABA terminology, you may think of stimulus response consequence instead of antecedent behavior consequence. These are two sets of descriptive words that basically mean the same thing. So moving forward, we will use these interchangeably, but antecedent behavior consequence is the ABC, or three-term contingency. So let's think of the three-term contingency in everyday life. So your doorbell rings. What do? Well, you walk to the door. The consequence of that is you see that your neighbor is there at the door. So the antecedent is the doorbell rings, you walk to the door, consequence is you see your neighbor. Okay, let's go for the next one. The light turns green, you step on the gas, your car moves forward. You see a Coke machine, you put money in, you get a Coke. These are really easy examples of antecedent behavior consequence in everyday life. Okay, so a parent is holding a cookie and the child can see it. So the child says to the parent, "Can I have a cookie, please?" Consequence is the parent gives child a cookie and says, "Good asking." Let's look at the same exact scenario with a little different response or a different behavior. The parent is holding a cookie within view of the child. The child throws a tantrum and tries to take the cookie from the parent. So the parent gives the child the cookie. So here, both consequences, the child gets the cookie, but the behavior is different, but the consequence is the same. Both behaviors increase the likelihood, the occurrence of this behavior is more likely to happen again because the child got the cookie both times. So now let's look at some examples that may happen in a school setting. The teacher hands the student a new worksheet. The behavior, the student slides out of the desk onto the floor. The consequence is the teacher talks to the student about his behavior for about 2 minutes. Antecedent, the teacher works independently for 10 minutes. The behavior, students blurt out. So the consequence, the teacher moves closer to the student, increases the proximity to the student. So a third example is the teacher says, computer time is over, time for math. So one particular student runs into the hall, and so then the teacher puts that student in timeout. So what does positive reinforcement look like? Can a verbal reprimand be positive reinforcement? The point is to make here that reinforcement is not designed by what it looks like, but what the effect it has on the behavior. This is a critical distinction because in the past, people have delivered interventions based on what the problem looked like, not on what the purpose was that it served. And oftentimes they would just strengthen the problem behavior. So it's so important that when we look at our ABC recording or we look at our antecedent behavior and consequence, we think in depth about what the function of that behavior is. Because then that way we can figure out what type of reinforcement or what reinforcer will best likely increase the future frequency of the behavior. So a student interrupts frequently because each time they do that, the teacher gives him a lecture. He enjoys that attention from the teacher. A student has a meltdown when he's asked to leave the computer because you know what? Every time he has that meltdown, the teacher has given him 5 more minutes. Does anyone have children? If your child asks you over and over and over for something and you continually say no, then your child knows that your answer will always be no. But if you give in and say yes, then that reinforces the child to ask and ask and ask. So a third example here is the student flaps his hands because in the past it has resulted in a preferred sensory experience that the student may enjoy. So they continue to flap their hands because they enjoy that experience. Okay, so we're looking at positive reinforcement here with our antecedent behavior consequence chart. And then we're going to look at how that reinforcement predicts things for the future. Because positive reinforcement occurs when something a student desires is presented after the appropriate behavior has been exhibited. So the teacher asks student to work independently. The child falls into the floor. So peers point and laugh at the student. Well, in the future, the student's going to continue to fall on the floor because obviously the student likes this attention. Okay, so it's snack time and the child screams for chips. The consequence is someone gives him chips. So in the future, this child will continue to scream when they want something because in the past they have been reinforced by getting the chips. All right, it's nap time. So the child begins to cry. The adult picks up the child and comforts the child. Guess what? In the future, the crying will increase. Nap time. The child pitches a fit or a tantrum to get a toy, so guess what? The adult gives the toy. So in the future, the tantrum behavior persists. In all of these examples, you are increasing the likelihood that the behavior will happen again because of the consequence that's been given. Now, are all of these examples good? Remember in the beginning of the lecture I said that just because positive is paired with the word reinforcement, it does not necessarily mean a good thing. Because do you want your student or your child always screaming for chips? Absolutely not. So do not view positive reinforcement always as something good. Think of it as adding something to increase the likelihood that this behavior will happen again in the future. We just went through this. The word positive does not refer to the pleasantness of the stimulus. It's just something added or applied to the situation. These words in blue, bold, and italics are things that have been confusing to many learners. So I wanted to make sure that we go through this to make sure that you know that this works to increase the frequency of a behavior it follows is a positive reinforcer, even if it does not seem like it should be rewarding. Okay, so here we're talking about that positive has nothing to do with pleasant again. It just means the addition of a stimulus. These are some drawings that might help you. The visualization of the behavior is increased because we add something to increase behavior. What you are adding does not have to be pleasant. It just has to increase the behavior. If you want to print this slide and keep that, that's a great way to help you remember the definition of positive reinforcement. Okay, so here's two examples of positive reinforcement. A high school student helping around the house gets to borrow the family car. And a waitress receiving high tips for her pleasant service. Helping around the house is behavior to reinforce, and borrowing the car is the added stimulus, just as the pleasant service is the behavior to reinforce and high tips is the added stimulus. Both of these increase the likelihood of the behavior occurring again in the future. So we want to show relevant examples so that you'll be able to see these terms demonstrated in classrooms in realistic terms when it comes to your students. So your problem is your student attendance is down. So your professor gives extra credit if they maintain perfect attendance during the quarter and his students' attendance increased dramatically. Well, why? Because the extra credit is an example of positive reinforcement because something is added to increase the behavior. The extra credit is added to increase the behavior of attendance in the class. So next we have students don't participate in class. So now the students are going to gain bonus points for participation. The addition of bonus points is an example of positive reinforcement because something is added to increase the behavior being participation in class. Students constantly talk out of turn. So, every time the student raises their hand, they are going to be given verbal praise for following directions. And praise is an example of positive reinforcement because your teacher is trying to encourage a behavior raising their hand to be called on, increasing the likelihood that that behavior will happen again. So before we talk about the types of positive reinforcers, we want to think about when we're choosing a reinforcer. They must be valued, preferred, and individualized. Because what may be extremely motivating for one student may be entirely useless for another. So let's talk about a few guidelines when choosing a reinforcer. Observing the student. What kind of activities does he or she seek out? What objects or events are presently serving to reinforce his or her behavior? Think about during non-preferred activities. What are things that would reinforce the student? And ask the student. When designing a plan to modify behavior, always give students a list of choices and ask what he or she would like to earn. We all know that if we have some type of ownership or have stake in something, we definitely work harder to gain that. For example, if the token economy for work is completed, let the student choose from a list of activities to find out what they are interested in. Because if you automatically give them computer time and they actually love to read, then you're actually not giving them something to increase the likelihood that that behavior will happen in the future, because that's not a reinforcer that is valued or preferred to that student. And then monitor is to periodically review by discussing with or observation to see if that reinforcer remains preferred or if it's time to come up with a new reinforcer. And then of course is evaluate. As educators, we evaluate everything that we're doing all the time to make sure that we don't need to make any changes or that what we're doing is actually working. So now let's talk about the types of positive reinforcers. Natural and direct reinforcement. This results directly from the appropriate behavior. Because if you're interacting appropriately with your friends in a group activity, that will lead to more invitations to those type of activities. The natural reinforcement for appropriate bids for attention, help, participation, all of that is providing the attention, help, and opportunity to participate. The goal should always be to move the student into these natural reinforcements. Next, we have social reinforcers. These are reinforcers that are socially mediated by your teacher, your parent, some adult, or peers to express approval and praise for the appropriate behavior. They can be comments such as, "Good job," "I can tell you're working very hard." It could be written approval such as things like "super" or "great" written on your work. And expressions of approval can be smiling, clapping, a high five, a pat on the back, nodding of your head. And all of these are very effective reinforcers. Activity reinforcers are very effective and positive for students because they allow students to participate in a preferred activity, such as games, computer time, etc. Now, activity reinforcers is very powerful, especially if part of the reinforcement is being allowed to choose a classmate to participate in this activity, because this also provides social reinforcement from the partner or person that they choose. A tangible reinforcer is just what you would think. It's something that they can eat. A toy, a balloon, a sticker, some type of award. Now, you want to be careful when you choose things that are edible or a toy, because parents may have some reason that they would object to food as reinforcement. And also with all of the different dietary needs, allergies, diets, things of that nature, you would want to be careful with using edible reinforcers. And even some schools don't allow that. And then toys, that could breed some bullying or some jealousy, so use that with caution. So awards can be in the form of certificates, displaying work, letters home to their parents. These are also very powerfully motivating reinforcers. It doesn't necessarily have to be, Skittles or things like that. A token reinforcement involves awarding points or tokens for appropriate behavior. And these awards have little value in themselves, but they can be exchanged for something of value. It can involve an actual physical reward, such as candy or some other treat. but the students would have to work towards the token reinforcement or the token economy where they are building up towards the end of the week. But you want to also be sure that it matches or is individualized to the student, because sometimes the token economy, it may be too long for the reinforcement for some student. Here are some things that we need to think about when delivering reinforcement. It must be delivered immediately. Students should know that when they can expect reinforcement. If you wait until the end of the day to reinforce a student for remaining in her seat during second period, the effect of reinforcement is reduced, if not lost. It is impossible to deliver reinforcement immediately. If it is impossible to do that, then verbal reinforcement should be given, and the students should be told that they can expect what other reinforcement was promised at a later time. That way, the contingency between the behavior and the reinforcement is still strengthened and maintained. Next, improvement should be reinforced. Do not wait until the student has mastered or it's perfect to deliver reinforcement. You should recognize improvement and let the student know that you recognize the effort. Here we have 5-to-1 ratio. You should be giving out 5 positive comments to every 1 negative or neutral comment that you may say. But do not give reinforcement because you feel sorry for a student. If a student doesn't achieve the required criterion, delivering reinforcement will only teach the student that rewards are readily available regardless of the behavior, and may even lead to an increase of the undesired behavior. So recognize that you know the student is disappointed, but they will have the opportunity to try again. Reinforcement must be contingent on the behavior. Next, whenever possible, pair with the social reinforcement. If the reinforcement plan is letting the students participate in a preferred activity, make sure that you give them some type of social reinforcement, such as telling the student that they did an awesome job and they should be proud of themselves, or like we already mentioned, let them choose a friend to do the activity with them. Make sure that your social reinforcers are not ambiguous. They should be sincere, clear, and identify the specific behavior for which they are being delivered. And lastly, and one of the most important to me, is that your reinforcement should be age appropriate. If you're expecting a high school student to change his behavior by rewarding him with a sticker, is likely to be ineffective and could also be insulting to the student. So here I've made a toon-do or a cartoon strip to show a type of reinforcement. And if you look at this, can you automatically see the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence? And then once you see that, can you tell what type of reinforcer this is? Remember, it has to be observable behaviors. This one is pretty easy. The teacher says, turn in the homework. Jane turns her homework in, and John can't find his. So the teacher says, great job, Jane. She reinforces Jane for turning in the homework. And then what type of reinforcer is this? Right, it's social reinforcement because of the words that the teacher has said to Jane. So this is a summary of positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is a consequence delivered immediately following a behavior that increases the likelihood that the behavior will be maintained or increased in the future. Remember the types that we discussed: natural, social, token, activity, and tangible. Now, many students will need a combination or all types depending on the context of the environment. But remember, there should be at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positive comments to negative or neutral made to the student. It is best to make activities positively reinforcing by accessing the student's strengths and interests during non-preferred activities. The teacher's effect can have a strong impact on the effectiveness of specific praise. Remember, teacher words are very powerful.